Welcome to Acton, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute, and today I am joined by Noah Gould. Noah Gould is a colleague, alumni, and student programs manager at Acton. Noah is also a contributing writer for Young Voices, and today we'll be talking about sort of the contours of religion and faith in God, particularly the shape that religion and faith in God takes for those who are kind of on a journey from atheism and skepticism to Christian faith. There have been a couple of high-profile cases. Late last year, Noah reviewed the political scientist Charles Murray's latest book, Taking Religion Seriously for Christianity Today, and it recounts that sort of journey. It's a great for instance of this. But Charles Murray is not alone. Noah, welcome to Acton, and thank you for being with us.
Great to be here. Excited to talk about this topic.
So when I was thinking about this and going over some of the articles we're going to discuss today and some of the things we've talked about a lot in the Acton break room over the last couple months, I was thinking, are we in this moment that's sort of like an inverse sort of new atheism moment? Like in the early 2000s, there was like a very bold, invigorated, public-facing atheism. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, were all sort of the four horsemen of this movement, and they were sort of loud and proud public atheists, and they got a lot of converts in that time. That movement sort of fizzled and waved, but right now we've got a lot of people who are skeptics, atheists, who are coming, if not to faith, at least to being seekers, or just interested in having questions and having conversations about God that they might not have been interested in having a decade, 2 decades ago. What do you make of this moment?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. That, for lack of a better term, it's a kind of vibe shift of sorts. I like the parallel to the New Atheists because there was a sense then that this was the respectable intellectual position, especially this idea of, religion is a lie and religion has been bad for society as a whole. Now we see a lot of people maybe in two broad camps, and we can talk about, we'll dive into the specifics of different people, but there's the camp of people who seem to have experienced genuine conversions in different ways, and then another camp that has either been calling themselves cultural Christians, or I call it kind of a poetic truth of Christianity. They see these ideas of kind of Christian culture as broadly good, but they don't have any sort of personal faith themselves. So those are two broad camps you see that are talking about it, and there's a kind of new intellectual respectability that was maybe not there 10 or 20 years ago.
So one of the books, I think, that has been instrumental for like a lot of these people in both of those camps you outlined is Tom Holland's Dominion, British historian Tom Holland. And in that book, he makes a similar sort of argument that was made in an old Acton documentary, Birth of Freedom, which is very similar to which was based on the work of the sociologist Rodney Stark, who did a lot of this. Because I think it's good to get that thesis out in front of people, because a lot of people are interacting right with that. And for some people, that's the beginning of considering Christianity seriously that leads to a sort of genuine conversion. And for some people, it just sort of stops at that sort of Tom Holland, Rodney Stark thesis. What is that general thesis?
Yes, I mean, in very broad strokes, this idea of the modern world and things that we just don't think about, but we think of as goods. These are created by Christian ideas. So that's kind of the broad thesis. And I should say that when I mentioned earlier this idea of, intellectual respectability, what I mean is perception of intellectual respectability. Right? This has been a tradition that's been developed for a long time, and now certain people are
2,000
discovering.
years.
Yeah, exactly. For a period of time.
Yeah.
And so there's a change in perception of respectability. But yes, people like Rodney Stark have been exploring these ideas. And really from the Enlightenment, we have a lot of conversations about how do we get here? What are the foundations of society? And if we give up those foundations, what are we left with? So this is a very modern question, and we're just kind of experiencing it in a certain way right now.
So one of the folks that a couple of years back, I think this is 2023, Ayaan Hirsi Ali wrote a sort of column about why she calls herself a Christian now. And I think this was published originally in Unheard, was republished in the Free Press, made the rounds. That is a big part of her argument for embracing Christianity. What was that argument, and what do you make of that? Because it's a really fascinating piece, and we'll link to it in the show notes. And there's a lot to talk about. Because her sort of religious trajectory wasn't a straight line from atheism, skepticism to Christianity, but it was a journey that she was born to a Muslim family. She went through a period of radicalization under the Muslim Brotherhood, and then at a certain point renounced that sort of extremism and thought the easiest, cleanest way to do that was to just reject religion in toto. But then she has come around to appreciating Christianity. What did you think of that piece, and what are some of the things you noticed about it?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, her story is a little bit of a departure from some of the patterns of the story we see, where there's kind of a person who's agnostic, always thought that religion wasn't intellectually respectable, and then is rediscovering it. But for her, there was this early childhood and early adulthood traumatic experience with religion, as far as violence against women, Muslim extremism, very extreme Muslim sect that she encountered. So for her, yes, she thought, this new atheism, this is the place to be. This is the respectable position, and she has, threats against her life and these sorts of things, real stakes for those beliefs. So the Unheard article that she published, why she was a Christian, actually, interestingly, when it was first published, you could kind of get the sense from this article that she was still figuring out how to articulate her conversion. And some people critiqued that article thinking it was just kind of asserting a type of cultural Christianity. Like, Christianity is necessary for culture, Christianity is necessary for society, to continue on as a society, this types of argument.
She talks about it in terms of Christianity as a necessary sort of ideological framework to battle sort of totalitarian movements in the world. Be they the sort of authoritarianism of Russia and China, be they a sort of radical Islamism, or be they what she called wokeism, or sort of, and she thought, you need more than that an absence can't, that you need an actual sort of ideology to fight that, and that Christianity provided the framework for that sort of ideology, a very sort of clash of civilizations type narrative.
So some people critiqued that, including I had questions about the first article that came out. Is she actually a believer? Is this kind of a personal conversion, as well as this idea of a necessity on a civilizational level? And later on, she did clarify, yes, she's been baptized, and this was something that was a real conversion. But you see this sometimes, people are still figuring out, it's a very personal thing. How do I articulate this? How do I share about it? What is some of the secondary arguments for believing, primary arguments, these types of things? And she was still figuring that out in the midst of writing this article.
So this is something, and we're going to be talking about a lot of people here, and I want to make it very clear to our audience, we're not intending to devalue or dismiss or question the legitimacy of any of these folks' religious experience, or anybody's. And part of that, there was an old piece, old interview with Mahatma Gandhi years and years ago. This is, I think it was published in the 40s, where they asked him, because he had this habit of saying that all religions were true, and this reporter asked him, like, how can you say this? Religions say materially different things. How can you say this? And he responded by saying, in part, and it's a long, complicated answer and a very interesting answer, and we'll link to it in the show notes. He said, if we search, we may find as many religions as there are men. Hundreds of men are merely striving to know the truth, and they will put the truth in their own way. No two men will put it in identical terms. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of people, even of the same religious tradition, they have different levels of education, different levels of maturity, different personal experiences that have shaped the way they think about their own faith and the way they articulate it to others. And there's a legitimate diversity there. There is no, right answer to all of these questions, particularly when you're talking about and trying to explore your own religious experience and to share that with other people. So,
yeah, and there may be even different levels of comfort in how people are able to talk about it, right? Some people are very comfortable talking about these things publicly, some people less so, and we're talking about different public figures who have chosen to some degree or less to talk about these stories, but even among those, there may be different levels of what they're willing to share as well. But I mean, what we can do is go off of what they share and how they define it themselves.
Absolutely. So one of the other folks, before we get to Murray, because you mentioned in your piece, in your review for Christianity Today, you mentioned two other people. One of them was Ayaan Hirsi Ali. The other was Molly Worthen. Molly Worthen has a different sort of story than Ali. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so Molly Worthen is a scholar and journalist on kind of intellectual history and has written a very influential book on kind of evangelicalism and was kind of writing on religion as an outsider. She called herself kind of a mildly dissatisfied agnostic, which is a fascinating category, but was writing on kind of different figures and was very interested in the topic, but wasn't a Christian herself and wouldn't call herself a Christian, but was seeking, for lack of a better word, she says, and looking for truth. And she grew up with this kind of we'll talk about Murray, but similar to Murray, where it was just kind of expected and unstated that religion was kind of not a respectable thing to believe if you were a thinking person. And so she kind of dismissed it out of hand and had a kind of aversion to it. And then slowly, as she's studying it, more openness and more questions. And then over a series of conversations with J.D. Greear, who of Summit Church,
in North Carolina,
he literally evangelizes her, answers questions that she's been wondering, and has this kind of back and forth exchange, and eventually converts to Christianity. And so she had earlier been baptized in a high church Episcopal setting, and was just kind of, she describes it as being in turmoil of, she thought, well, maybe this will help resolve my questions, but it really didn't. So really a fascinating kind of journey that she's experienced.
Yeah. There's a great interview that Noah shared with me that we'll put in the show notes, where she recounts some of this. There were a couple of things that were really, really striking in that interview to me. The first was that you mentioned she grew up in a sort of secular household, and she does maintain that, but she also has a sort of uniquely hostile, above and beyond her parents. At one point, her mother, in fact, sat her down and tried to read her little Bible stories because, as a cultured human being, you should know who David and Goliath are, the very basic sort of, and she, at one point, like plugged her ears, like was actively like, this is boring. I don't want anything to do with it. And then there was some family friends that invited them to their church, and she remembers attending that church service and just hating it, just not feeling out of place, feeling like she didn't fit, not knowing what to do, which I thought was really, really interesting. A lot of people, even people who grew up religious to some extent, who fall away, a lot of that link that to experience of having their parents drag them to church, not knowing why they were there, not liking it. They just develop this sort of taste that sticks with them into adulthood. And I thought that was a very interesting example of that. The other thing that I wanted to ask you, and this gets into more of our personal religious background and how we interpret this. I'm a Roman Catholic. Noah's an evangelical ish
Presbyterian,
but not mainline. But when I read about her being baptized, I was like, no, that's the moment. Like, that's what makes somebody, in my religious tradition, a Christian, is baptism. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a Catholic baptism to count. Form and matter have to be there. There's a particular, you have to be baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There is a particular form, particular matter. But that's the juice. It's not any sort of intellectual assent, although intellectual assent is good and should be cultivated. The beginning of faith, even faith is a gift fundamentally, and it's a gift given by God in the sacraments. So that was very interesting to me that's something that she didn't really feel as like interpret, even years later, now that she's come to a sort of fully realized, self-conscious affirmation of Christianity in the Bible, that the way she thinks about it is still that was a time in which she wasn't a Christian. And my question in reflecting on this and thinking through this is, how much should we think about our identity as Christians as being primarily one that's grounded in a certain beliefs about, let's say, the resurrection? How much of it comes from us and from our assent to certain dogmas, and how much of it is a gift from God, and then you can live up to that or fall short from that? And this isn't to say that everything in the Christian life is done in baptism. You have to keep returning to that gift of faith. But yeah, how do you think about that?
Yes, this brings up several questions.
Yeah.
Those are fantastic. One, I think, and we should talk about this more, is this idea of conversion, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all think about conversion as like this. What is the moment of conversion? That's a classic question for someone's testimony. When is, and Augustine's Confessions has everyone who've students who have read it over generations have debated what the point is. There's multiple points you can point to in his conversion story. We think of, I think Paul's road to Damascus is central to our imagination on conversions. That is a moment of divine revelation where, he is, spiritually can see and then is literally blind, and it's this. It can't get any starker than this. So that's, I think, at the center of our imagination. And I read about this in the piece on Charles Murray because I think you see him personally wrestling with this question of, is he converted? Mm-hmm. And I think he, in some sense, undersells his own conversion in important ways. But my tradition is, a tradition that we take a high view of God's sovereignty and what is happening. And I do think that the Christian life can be viewed as, this progression of being called by the divine, right? That is, and it is this, what point can you point to? What moment can you point to? Many different moments. I think back to my own story. I was, raised in the church my whole life. I was baptized at the age of 13. The most evangelical riverside baptism. I went under, and as I went under, a bald eagle flew over the congregation. Yes. Most of my friends missed my baptism because they were watching the bald eagle. So, it doesn't get more American and evangelical than that. And then I've now come more to historically reformed tradition. So I'm part of the PCA church. And so, this is an emphasis of how all these different things, whether it's experiencing the sacraments, or whether it is, of course, that assent of believing in God, the assent of faith. The question here the answer here in my mind is a yes and. There is this. It's a movement towards the divine, and I do wonder. how Molly in 10 years will look back at her conversion, because it is this deeply personal thing that happens, and it's hard to figure out what's happening while you're in the middle of it. But another classic motif in conversion stories is the change before and after. That's often the thing you can see. How is your life different before and after? And that's another thing that people can point to as well as part of their story. So that only answers a part of your larger question, but I think it's worth thinking about what are our assumptions about conversions.
Oh yeah, and I don't think there's any quick, clean answers here. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about reading these narratives and reading other people's perspectives, is it causes you to think through your own convictions about this sort of thing. And when you mentioned Paul, I naturally think of Peter, who on the one hand is the first to declare Christ the Messiah, but then he's the one to deny him 3 times. So does he not become a Christian in that moment? Or is that a moment in which, while Peter is distancing himself from God, God is still trying to bring him closer and bring him finally, and Peter's faith doesn't end in that moment. I always think about, part of this is I tend to downplay the role of the intellect in these things, which is something that none of the people we're talking about do. Exactly. I tend to think about, I make mistakes all the time. I change my ideas about things over the course of years, sometimes afternoons. And ultimately, I think, the mind is just going to do what it does. And if I had to that would be a precarious place for me to put my faith, is about my degree of belief in the moment. It's rather a sort of conviction that God is always working to bring me to that, rather than the idea that, if I have a doubt, this is like some sort of existential crisis for me. That's just a doubt. This is the mind's job, is to find problems, to go down interesting rabbit holes, to pose questions. So I guess this is the other question, is how much of this, because this is a conversation that's happening about people who are very serious about ideas, people who take ideas very seriously, and it's about people who read and think for a living, which you and I do too. But how much of that is representative of the experiences of most people, and is that the way we should be thinking about this?
Mm-hmm. So certainly your point about faith being a gift, something that's given from God, I think is important, and it gives us assurance that over time these things, we don't have to wake up every day saying, oh, do I believe to a degree enough today to be a Christian, right? Mm-hmm. That's not how it works. But there is a sense in which our faith is not an anti-intellectual exercise. Yep. It is a bringing together of these things. So I think there is a role of intellect, but part of the role of intellect is growing more and more in knowledge and love, right? So that's, I think, the intellect itself is a kind of movement towards God. I desire to know more, I desire to understand more, but it's not an intellectual purity test. Yeah. It's like, oh, you had a thought, a questioning thought. Sorry, you're out.
Yeah. This brings us back around to Murray, because one of the very interesting things in Murray's experience is the role his wife plays. Mm-hmm. And this is the way many people, you talk about, in the Catholic Church, most people who enter the Catholic Church as adults enter into the Catholic Church because they're getting married to a Roman Catholic. Mm-hmm. That's a very common experience for people. And Murray's wife was a religious woman and a Quaker, and that Murray talks about as being sort of the beginning of his investigation. What does that investigation look like for Murray as he unpacks it in that book?
Yes, there's a few different levels of investigation, and he takes it seriously. This is like for Murray, the point where he really gets into the nitty-gritty of ideas and thinking through faith seriously, he takes it as this massive research assignment. He really is like a researcher down to the point of his personal religious journey. But really where his, he had this kind of assumption that faith and religion was just kind of not respectable, not something that smart people believed. And then when his wife had, I believe, their first child, her conversion goes something like, how do I have this much love for this child in my heart?
Very Whittaker Chambers, sort of. Yeah,
yes, absolutely. This is a type and degree of love at which I have no rational explanation for. And so that kind of takes her down this whole journey of faith. And so she's part of the Quaker tradition, which is very specific, especially in their emphasis on mystery, and the services look very different from a church service. It's
Friends General Conference.
Oh yes, indeed. Which probably something you know more about the nitty gritty, but
it's not actually church; it's meetings.
So different people can talk at different times.
Yeah.
And
but they're like, even the language is very different. That it's you attend the meeting. You don't attend church.
Yes.
Church is the people of God, and that can't be limited to any building or any assembly. And you sit in a circle and you're quiet until you're moved to speak. And it's a very contemplative form of Christianity, and it's very beautiful in its own way. But,
yes. So he talks about attending with his wife for many years and being kind of a part of this community, but not having any kind of faith personally, and then taking this next chapter of his life to explore faith very particularly. So what's fascinating about the book is it's worth getting just for the reading list that he provides. All the different things he goes through, the historicity of the Christian Gospels, when were they written, and has some very classic arguments, some arguments that are more new, like what are the common first names in Palestine at this time? So in this area of the world, what are common first names? And a historian who pulls data from like gravestones and records and creates this massive database, and then compares the New Testament accounts to the name database to see if it matches up with something that would have been written in this time. And not only do the names match up, but even like more common names, those are the names that then get the modifier in the account. So because you'd get these two people with common names confused, versus some of the non-canon Gospels have much more generic later names that you'd expect from either someone who's writing at a later date trying to sound like this period or whatever. So that's an argument that I had never heard before, in addition to more classic arguments for the scripture, the existence of God. These are different things that he kind of went through exploring. And I mean, this is my own personal judgment, but I get the sense after reading the book that he is still in the middle of this search. And I mean, aren't we all in some ways?
Yeah.
But yes, he's writing this at a point where he is right now, but who knows where he may end up.
This reminded me a little bit of Molly Worthen, and one of the things that she got into was sort of research into the historicity of the resurrection and the reliability of the gospel narratives. And this is like a fascinating field in general. But what struck me is odd is, she was, a PhD historian. Charles Murray is a social scientist, has lived, is probably in his 80s now?
I believe so.
And, long illustrious career. These sorts of arguments, while they're very interesting, and there are always new arguments along these lines, but the basic foundational reliability of the New Testament accounts, historicity of Jesus as like an actual, Jesus of Nazareth is an actual person. I find it surprising how many folks aren't familiar with this literature. I mean, you could ask, and I have asked, like Google Gemini, like, is Jesus a historical person? and it will say yes and give and point you
Yep.
to these sources. I'm very glad that these folks got curious and dug into this and examined this scholarship. But why is it that that this is something that I don't remember a time not knowing existed? Like if you go to the library and you search for like historical Jesus, like in the card catalog, like it's not because there's not like a dearth of these evidences. And there's also many publishers who publish popularizations of this sort of research. Is it just that if you're in a certain social milieu, you're never going to like come across those keywords to search? You're never going to, read a book on this until you come to this like searching moment? I think that's a fascinating question as to how you could be sort of isolated from sort of New Testament scholarship in that way. And maybe this is a story of, you get religiously curious and you very shortly become familiar with this stuff. And maybe this is how do we make this more accessible? I'm thinking, who's it? Wesley Huff, the apologist. He was on Joe Rogan not too long ago. And he's like blowing Joe Rogan's mind with like, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yep.
And it's like, people found out about this 80 years ago. Like, and not just religious believers, but you could talk to atheists who are familiar with this literature, who are scholars in these fields. I can't quite figure out why this is such a surprise to so many people. I'm glad it's a wonderful surprise to have, but I don't know how you make this sort of research more accessible, because again, it's not just these high-level academics. There's all sorts of popularizations. I wrote a review last Easter on a very great popular 80-page account of research into the historicity of the resurrection. This is like weekend reading.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's multiple answers to your question as far as, why people haven't encountered. There's certainly in the academic field a degree of specialization that, if you're an expert in a certain field and you're not in the religion department, you probably haven't seen these texts. There's also, you can study about religion without really diving into the real questions of importance. The question of how you fix it, I do think there has to be an orientation of education towards truth-seeking. Religion is one of the most, if not the most important questions wrapped up together. And so encouraging people to kind of begin this search for themselves. That's something that Murray is very intent on doing, saying you don't have to have the same conclusions as me in any way, but if you're ignoring these questions, that's kind of a huge loss. They're questions you need to be asking. So I do think there may be just a certain number of people who haven't been keyed on to, hey, this is a search that you need to be making, and these are important questions. It also just might be something about the way that the world of publishing works, where you either read Christian books or you don't read Christian books, and they're in that section, and that's a scary section for you. And so there's something to be said for books that make any attempt to cross genres. Yeah. So Huff was able to get on the biggest podcast in the country, I think maybe the world, to talk about these ideas. So he was, and that's a risk for him. It could have gone poorly to go on Rogan. It's a massive platform, but he took the risk and crossed audiences to get these ideas across. Murray is trying to do that from kind of his vantage point as an intellectual elite to talk to people in his kind of in his milieu. And so any attempts to do that, I think, are really admirable.
So we talk about the path that Murray's taken. Where does he wind up? Because it's not in the place, at least yet, of the previous two folks we've talked about. Where does Murray, how does he appraise this evidence, and has it affected the way that he thinks about his sort of personal faith or lack thereof.
So on a number of the questions, kind of as far as the existence of God, the historicity of the Gospels, he ends up affirming. As far as Jesus' relationship to the divine, he says Jesus has some sort of special relationship to the divine, is where he kind of ends as far as when he at time of publishing. He dismisses the birth account kind of almost offhand, which is one of the interesting parts of the book. He doesn't really dive into the historical account of Jesus' birth. And then the resurrection, it seems like he affirms a resurrection. And then he has a fascinating part where he talks about the change of his life before and after. And one of the things he says is that he had planned to kind of commit suicide toward the end of his life at some point before this religious experience, or before this change in opinion. And now he doesn't see that as an option. So that's that's a huge jump. And he almost understates it. And I say, well, if that's not a type of conversion, what is? I mean, the value of your own life, that something is in control above yourself. These are all foundational questions. But he ends the book with this really Lewisian analogy. It could be right out of a C.S. Lewis book. He says that he still feels like a little kid with his nose pressed up against the window of the bright room of faith. So there's this bright room, and he's a child looking in from the outside. So he still feels like that. And he talks about kind of not having a religious or emotional experience. So it's a really striking analogy. Of course, I immediately think of, whoever, knock on the door and it shall be opened unto you. These verses about those who seek and those who are, it seems like he's almost quoting that passage. And so we have these promises about those who seek. But I bring up a bit about kind of Kierkegaard's leap of faith, because I do think that category is helpful to understand this sort of reasonable march of, the cosmic argument for God and the historicity of the scriptures. I do think that can get us to a certain degree, but how far can it get you? And does there have to be a point where you say, and I believe that I might understand, right? Is that a jump that is maybe in Murray's future, or that he's in the middle of, that might help get out of a purely objective search for faith?
I always think that many times religious conservatives, and there's good reasons for this historically because of sort of liberal theology and in this sort of 18th and 19th century, put a lot of stock in religious experience. But I think religious experience is fundamentally like this should transform your life. You should have some sort of experience of God. And if you don't have that, all of the arguments, even if you accede to all the arguments, you might find yourself on the outside looking in. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of folks that I think they're seeking, they're finding things, but they don't really feel like they fit or they belong, even if they have an experience. And so a lot of people talk about being very, that they believe in God or that they're spiritual or not religious. And I always think when we're talking about these sorts of questions, what are the advantages and disadvantages of grouping sort of faith in God and religion together as a question? I think they go together. I think they're better together.
They're related. Yes. Yeah.
Peanut butter and jelly. But I also think that when people think, I either have to be this, or I can't buy any of it, or I've got to find some rationalization to dismiss it all. I think that's unhealthy too. I don't really have an answer to that question, but I was wondering your thoughts.
No, and I don't think it's something that we can, maybe it's one of these questions we can't have an answer to, right? How do these things fit together? And I appreciate those who are willing to put pen to paper and talk about how they're personally wrestling with these things. You know, if the kind of change in your life that comes after change of beliefs or thinking about things in a new way, that itself is a type of religious experience. It might not be the emotional experience that a person is expecting. They might have preconceived notions about breaking down in tears, and this is what a religious conversion experience is going to be, and that's how I'll know. But this type of thing, like Murray's talking about, the realization that you have different views about the end of your life.
Yeah.
That's a type
That's
of
huge.
experience, right? We
That
can
is.
describe that in experiential terms. You're experiencing a different view of what the world is and what reality is,
What
and
what you are.
what your place in the world is, what your duties are. It's fascinating, right? And so, but we do have categories of experience versus maybe intellect that often can get muddy. Those are, and think of the analogy of two people standing next to each other, singing the same hymn at church. And it might, maybe it's a hymn that's 200 years old. So not only are they singing it together, but they're singing with all the people who have sung this hymn over history. The two of them might be having a very different experience. They by definition are.
Yep.
One of them could be in tears and meditating on the words and barely able to sing, and the other person could be just reflecting on the meaning and having a very cerebral experience. But they're both singing about the same thing. They're both together, and so that is one of the ways that an organized religion can bring someone into something that's larger themselves. And when different people have different experiences or faith or lack of faith at different times, that larger group can help them to kind of continue faith over time. So that is one of the tensions between the individual experience, individual belief, and then this communal experience and belief. So how these things all tie together is not cut and dry, but they're connected.
There's one last person I want to major figure before we talk about some broader things that I wanted to bring in, because the day we recorded this, the cartoonist Scott Adams passed away. Actually, just not too long before we record this. I just learned of it actually before I hopped down here into the booth. He's did the Dilbert cartoon for many years. Had a sort of controversial last chapter of his life where he did a lot of political commentary. But he wrote a sort of final message that he passed along. And I'm only going to read the first part of this because the first part of it is applicable to our conversation. But it's entitled "The Final Message from Scott Adams." It said, "If you are reading this, things did not go well for me. I have a few things to say before I go. My body failed before my brain. I am of sound mind as I write this, January 1st, 2026. If you wonder about any of my choices for my estate or anything else, please know that I am free of any coercion or inappropriate influence of any sort. I promise. Next. Many of my Christian friends have asked me to find Jesus before I go. I'm not a believer, but I have to admit that the risk-reward calculation for doing so looks attractive. So here I go. I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I look forward to spending an eternity with him. The part of me not being a believer should be quickly resolved if I wake up in heaven. I won't need any more convincing than that, and I hope that I am still qualified for entry." And this is a very classic sort of Pascal's wager restatement. And I don't know what I think about it. I've thought about it, in a classroom, in a philosophy classroom, when you think about that sort of Pascal's wager. And I think about in the Catholic Church, we have this concept of, you have baptism that makes you a Christian, But you also have this baptism of desire where, people, end of life, maybe they're not able to have access to the sacraments. But you can be baptized by desire. I'm not sure if this is that. I hope it is. I hope that in the unbelief, there's a desire for belief and the rest of it. But I thought this is a very a different thread to this conversation. I was wondering what you make of it.
Yeah, of course, like you mentioned, statements like this in a classroom versus, as a last statement carry a different weight. And of course, in some sense, the statement does have this Dilbertian irony, double irony, triple irony. You can tell that it's written by him. There's a sort of undercurrent of humor underneath it. And Dilbert is such dark humor in a very specific way. And of course, we can't know this side of paradise. This is not something that we are meant to know in certain ways. It is applicable to think about both on we talk about the civilizational level of this conversation and the personal level. Yeah. The parable of the vineyards and the workers in the vineyard. Yeah. I think of that parable. I'll just restate it briefly, but Jesus tells a parable that, there are workers that come to the master of the vineyard, and some start work at the beginning of the day, some come at noon, some come later in the day, and at the end of the day, he pays them all the same wage. And those who have worked the whole day complain. They say, this is unfair, and some people came an hour before, the shift ended. And he says, was I not generous enough with you? And they, of course, can't answer anything but, yes, it was a fair wage. He said, are you complaining because I'm generous, right? And of course, there's no answer to that. So, yeah, these types of conversions at the last hour are certainly possible, and certainly they do happen. But we can't really know. And with the Dilbertian layers of irony and double irony, it doesn't make it easier to parse. But
absolutely. There's a larger conversation going on today. There have been a lot of sort of trend stories about, is there a sort of religious revival going on in America? We've talked about some prominent thinkers, intellectuals, personalities who have been going on various kinds of journeys. Is this something that's sort of in the water from your reading? Is this something that we talk about? We talked about sort of 4 cases now, and there's talk of it being a larger society-wide phenomenon. And what do you think? Yeah, so I do think that Ross Douthat gave a talk for Acton at our annual dinner last year. Very
that was
good talk.
Fantastic, and a phrase that he said that stuck with me, and it's very apt, is that as a society, we're thinking about having a revival. We're not there. It's too soon to tell, really, but we're kind of pondering it. And that's, I think, is where we're at, both what the data bear out, as far as, I think one of the best voices on this is Ryan Burge, and some of the data. He is very skilled at making complicated data very plain, but he had a recent piece that we can put in the show notes about, do the data bear out that we're in the midst of a revival? And he just lays out, here's the millions of people who would need to convert to overcome just the generational change that we're going to see from older generations dying and younger generations just having lower levels of religiosity. Yeah. And so just a very simple argument about demographics, but he basically says extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so we'll just continue to watch this story. There are, of course, early reports about certain churches with especially large amounts of young men who are rediscovering and exploring religion. So there are certain places where something very real is happening. Whether that is just specific places, we don't know yet. So we're thinking about it.
One of the things I thought about when I was thinking about this question is, and I was thinking of Ryan Burge as well, because he talks about, because I often wonder how would we see this, and he looks at it from data on church attendance.
Yep.
And I'm not sure that paints the whole story, because if you look at, you know, the folks, the religious tradition most likely to attend church once a week are evangelicals in the United States.
Yep.
And it's about 55% of them, which is actually, and I'll link to this data earlier, which is actually up since the 90s. In the 90s, it was like 42% of the evangelicals that attended weekly. But that's still 45% of self-identified evangelicals that aren't in church
Yep.
at any Sunday, let alone Roman Catholics. I'm sorry, but it's true. Or other religious traditions for that matter. So I'm wondering if, you know, one of the other things that Burge's done is said, you know, there actually aren't that many of the spiritual, not religious people. Like when you, I mean, there are a lot, but there are not as many as you think there are. But I think, you know, the way we think about religious people isn't going to even self-identified religious people aren't on any given Sunday. A plural, you know, if not a majority, a very large minority of them aren't attending every week. And there's a certain amount that never attend, that still identify as Roman Catholics, as evangelicals, as historically black Protestants. What do we make of that? Is there a possibility of a revival sort of outside the church? Because it seems like a lot of folks, you know, particularly the folks that want to assert a cultural Christianity, go back to those first two categories we talked about in the interview, they're not necessarily ever going to find a church home. And they probably shouldn't with that level of belief. They should look into it. They should explore deeply. They should do all those sorts of things. But there are a number of folks who may be like, you know, they listen to Joe Rogan, and maybe they got a kick out of that episode, and they think, you know what? Yeah, I believe in Jesus. You know, I believe Jesus rose from the dead, but they might never go through the door of a church. How do you think through that? Because this is a generation, that young generation, again, is the most unchurched generation we've had in a very long time in this country.
So that's certainly possible. You know, so you're suggesting another category of religious but not churched, right? That category, and I think if that category did increase, we'd see at least some increase in church attendance. You know, we'd probably see some increase in both. But that is a real category. I have friends who are Christians and who are kind of visiting churches and have been visiting churches for a few years and are have had a hard time finding a church that kind of fits them personally, coincides with certain beliefs that might be secondary beliefs, you know, that maybe non-theological beliefs. There's an interesting conversation around politics. Are we seeing like just a right-wing religious revival, and some people who are left-wing politically but religious are sort of alienated, can't figure out where they might fit? So that would be a category that might just be can't find a church, but they believe in certain ways. And so that could increase. I would expect to see, if we see an increase in that category, also see an increase in church attendance as well. But I do think that the data is just kind of too early to tell what exactly is happening. Is this a news story that's creating a news story kind of thing, or is this the early signs of a new trend?
So as you're looking at these early signs, this pre-contemplative revival, what are the things that you're following, paying attention to? You know, you're doing these book reviews. We've had a lot of conversations about this sort of thing. I always find the most insightful sort of way to think about this is talking to people I know and sort of how they navigate the world. And it ends up being like very mundane. Like they get married, they have a kid, and they start thinking, oh boy, maybe I should go back to church. Really helped me out as a kid. Or later in life, they fall away from church, and then all of a sudden, you know, they got a friend that invites them, and they think, he's a good friend, should go. They go, and they decide, you know, they like it. And then, you know, they bring their wife the next time, and all of a sudden they're volunteering and the rest of it.
Or another trend that I think is very real is people trying out church online first.
Yes.
They may be attending. I have friends who listened to Keller sermons for years.
Mm-hmm.
So very influenced by Tim Keller, deeply influential in their lives. And then eventually they said, okay, I think we got to go find a church.
Mm-hmm.
They went and found a church. And other people who have been attending a particular church online for many years, that then they eventually go in person to. So that there's kind of a trying out church online that is happening as well.
Yeah.
One of the things, my current larger project right now is what are places where community and churches are thriving, and what are the kind of markers that characterize a lot of these different places.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll have a piece coming out shortly on Fishtown in Philadelphia,
Which Charles Murray very famously wrote about.
So I'm diving into Fishtown discourse here with this piece, but I'll profile some different churches that are thriving there and think about why are they thriving. Like interviewed a Catholic church and a Baptist church. So that's one thing that I'm looking at, is interviewing particular congregations and thinking about, okay, why are they doing well? That doesn't need to be astronomical growth, but even small congregations that are thriving in their communities, and what are the markers, what are the reasons that explain that?
No, we'll certainly be looking forward to that. Thank you so much for your review, and thank you so much for this conversation, which I feel like is just like an extension of conversations that we continue to have and will continue to have.
If you want to get a taste of what it's like to be in the Acton coffee room, it's often these types of things. Oh, did you see this? This person published this. These are the conversations that, they just bring up 10 more conversations we need to have. So,
Noah, thanks for being one of those conversations we need to have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.